We are live. What's going on, everybody? My name is Mark. You're watching the BigCritique podcast. This is Dr. Darrin Porcher, former NYPD. Introduce yourself with any credentials I might have forgotten, Darrin.
My name is Dr. Darrin Porcher, and I'm basically happy to be on Eric's show. And we're going to speak to some real dynamic issues in relation to law enforcement, policing, I guess what to do and what not to do, and just the overall consensus in the wake of the George Floyd situation that happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So we're just going to have an information exchange in connection with his ideas, my ideas, and hopefully we can coalesce behind a solution that works on a national level.
Yeah, that's usually my hope. Putting out opinions is one thing, but like really putting together heads to think of practical solutions is something that I'm really all about. So first of all, let's take a look at George Floyd for a second. Number one, this isn't the first podcast that I've done for this. The first thing that I like to do when talking about this, because it's like the only real way you can address this is I exhaust all of my sympathies to the family and friends who lost them. I'm sure you've gone through this before. Not this particular, but losing somebody in general. It's really, really bad. It sucks. It's just an awful thing to experience, So first, I know for myself. I'm sorry?
No, I apologize.
No, I was going to say, first, I know for myself, I definitely like to exhaust all sympathies and condolences to his family. And, whatever you might want to say.
Well, Mark, this, of course, is a travesty, and this has now since arisen or become commensurate with it being an American tragedy, that being the impact of law enforcement on individuals and creating a death for someone that we question as to why should he have lost his life in the first place, considering he came into custody of law enforcement for a nonviolent offense. We have a video that's going viral, and it's sent chills down everyone's spine when they view it, because we all say to ourselves, how should someone lose their life as a result of coming into police custody for a nonviolent offense when police are ultimately here to serve and protect the public? And police are generally public servants. So I want to say upwards of 90% of what police do is service oriented, and only 10% is of an enforcement realm. So now we go to how can we make policing more quintessential for our society and cause less people to lose their lives as a result. And I'm happy that Mark and myself are going to discuss and have a discourse as to what we think works. I am not a proponent of the officer's action. I saw it as an aspect of over-aggressive policing coupled with a breakdown in supervision, because we didn't have the appropriate supervisory matrix to take control of the situation, deploy the officers accordingly, and if the need was necessary, remove the officer that had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. We clearly didn't see the execution of the policies that should have rolled out. And so therefore, we're having this conversation now in the wake of the riots that are happening, not just in New York City, but on a national level. And what is the voice of calm that can possibly get us to regress to a state of normalcy? When I say a state of normalcy, it's kind of difficult to chart what a state of normalcy is in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, because on a national level, it seems like a gross majority of Americans have been on a lockdown or stay-at-home request in terms of trying to stop the spread of the virus. And then we roll into something like this. It's really a tough time for us as Americans. And this is the time that we show that not only are we fit for the challenge, but we execute accordingly.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you anymore. So let's take a look at this for a second. So now my first question is this. I'm going to assume that the laws and regulations that take place, I know you're former NYPD, so the laws for New York and how officers are supposed to, immobilize a suspect are probably different state to state. Would that be correct?
Yes, but I want to say the foundation should be somewhat similar, because there's no such thing as a national policy on policing. Each police department has their own directives and guidelines or patrol procedures as a result of what the department they represent holds. But at the same token, when we speak to a use of force or an excessive use of force, That seems to be something that's consistent across the board in all departments, prohibiting a police officer from using the minimum amount of force necessary. And so here we have a clear case of an officer that failed to apply the minimum amount of force necessary, subsequently leading to the death of Mr. George Floyd.
Right. So, okay. I'm going to go ahead and assume right now, and I hate to use that word, but I will, that you're not all that well versed on the rules and regulations for the state that this happened in, which is Minneapolis. But what I would like to talk about is how this works in New York. And if you do understand how the rules in Minneapolis work, please let me know. But so in New York, right, if this happens, if this were to have happened in New York, right, obviously against policy still, what would happen, like, in the career of the officer? Would they go directly to jail? Would their unions come into play? Would they get, like, how does the legal process work? And what would the NYPD do to say this is clearly obvious mess up? Like, this is a tremendous deal. How do we prevent this from happening in the future? Like, what would that look like in New York?
Well, the first component of your question, in terms of my knowledge base in connection with Minneapolis, Minnesota's policing, I do have an understanding because I am a nationally recognized expert in connection with policing in the United States, so to speak. So when we look at what the laws on the books are in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they do not have the provisions that we have in the NYPD. Their provisions in the Minneapolis Police Department allow an officer to use force on, or I want to use the term of chokehold, but I just think that that's just such an abstract term. But that department allows an officer to use pressure to one's neck from a limited perspective. Now, in New York City, I should say the NYPD, there's diametric opposition to chokeholds being administered. This has been prohibited conduct for years on end. So when we look at the diametric differences between the NYPD's policies and the Minneapolis, Minnesota PD's policies, you do have differences. But one thing that's consistent across the board is that failure to use, I shouldn't say failure, but an officer should only use the minimum amount of force necessary to take a suspect into custody or to preserve the life of not just an officer, but a third party as well. Those policies are consistent across the board. So when you ask me in connection with the criminal justice proceeding, if an officer violates those policies, the criminal justice arena comes into play when an officer commits a crime. And when an officer commits a crime, that's when they're subjected to the rules and regulations in connection with that state penal law. If a person in the New York City, I shouldn't say a person, but let's say your average citizen in New York City was to commit to an act that involved choking another individual, subsequently leading to their death. In most instances, that would lead a police officer to probable cause to effect an unlawful arrest of that individual. But what's unique about the arrest or the prosecution of a police officer is we have to understand the duties and responsibilities of a police officer consist of allowing them to use deadly physical force against another person in defense of a third party or the officer. In addition to that, the duties and responsibilities of a police officer allow an officer to use physical force to restrain another person. There are no other professions that allow a person to use deadly physical force or force to detain another person. You may say, well, security guards have the ability to use force against an individual if they're working at a particular establishment, but you don't see the deadly physical force component unless, of course, we have, let's say, like someone that's a licensed owner of a firearm, and then they have peace officer status. But then we go back to the evaluation of a police officer when he or she uses deadly physical force. If this is within the context of their or discharge of their official duties, then what we do is an administrative evaluation of the officer's actions. That administrative evaluation is something that often runs consistent with what an internal affairs bureau or what an internal investigations component within that department would conduct. they would determine or assess if in fact that officer used the minimum amount of force necessary. The minimum amount of force necessary depends from person to person. That's somewhat subjective. And that's why the investigative entity would have to sit down with that officer to assess what in their mind they believed was the minimum amount of force necessary. If an officer states that he or she was in fear of their life, therefore they saw no other recourse but to employ deadly physical force, then you look at the aspects of the particular encounter and then you make the assessment as to if the level of force was in fact proper. That's no different in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Normally, an internal investigation would be conducted. Now, believe it or not, everyone says that it just took too long to arrest the officer. But if any, I genuinely believe that this was swift justice, to say the least. You had the other co-conspirators that were the officers that were just basically standing by that were terminated as a result of this officer's action by placing his knee in Mr. Floyd's neck. Now, I thought that was really quick because I don't think that the officers really got due process failed to act out in the course of that investigation. And, you know, depending upon where the officers were positioned, they can have a stern or stark argument that, hey, look, you know what, my positioning, I was, let's say, the third person down. I wasn't able to assess that the officer's knee was on Mr. Floyd's neck. And I'm just giving you hypotheticals. I'm not saying that that's the case or not the case, but I'm just trying to introduce what the arena of the internal investigation consists of. So you have the administrative proceeding, and then simultaneously you have the criminal proceeding. We saw the criminal proceeding come to fruition when the officer was taken into custody and charged with murder as it relates to his actions against Mr. Floyd. All you need is probable cause to make the arrest, which I think was clearly evident. Now, the evaluation phase after the grand jury indictment is going to determine and assess if we have information, or I should say material evidence that supports a conviction. The standard of proof for a conviction is beyond a reasonable doubt. Once again, this stuff is all universal on a national level. It's not restrictive to any municipality, so to speak. So through the court proceeding, that's when they're going to make the assessment to determine if the officer in fact believed that he was in the official discharge of his duties and he was in fear of his life. I think that that's a hard stretch for the officer to introduce a defense on that level. But at the same token, based on living in the United States, you are entitled to due process, and the court proceedings will roll out as a result. Ugly situation. Use of force is always ugly. But at the same token, these are the rights that are afforded to citizens whenever they're charged by police as a result.
Understood. It definitely, you going through the legal aspects of this definitely shines some light on some things that I would have just never really understood unless you explained it the way you did. So I'm going to take a look at this from a more practical standpoint of, like, you said before, if I understood you correctly, that officers can use deadly force if they deem necessary. So my question is this. What if we, as a nation, came together and said, we think we should retrain our officers self-defense-wise a little bit differently? To be a little bit more specific, I have a friend who studies forms of mixed martial arts, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to be specific, and he was saying it might be something worth looking into as a society to be like, all right, the way we use force right now to immobilize suspects, clearly there's a lot of room for error. What if we use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to immobilize suspects, or just to teach, our officers to defend themselves using that? What if we use that? Like, what do you think? Would that solve any problems? What do you think of that? What do you make of that?
Well, Hoist Gracie is a Hall of Fame Gracie Jiu-Jitsu person. And when we look at the results of his effectiveness in the ring, in the octagon, it clearly shows that he was great at what he did. So the translation of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu into policing is something that I'm open for. But police departments do practice, or they do train officers in self-defense quite frequently. And so as a result of that, it's one of these things where as cops generally get their training within the police academy, which normally runs for 6 months. After you leave the police academy, you're kind of on your own, so to speak, in terms of additional self-defense training. I mean, periodically, something may come in front of you. When I say come in front of you, but you may have the ability to take a self-defense course. But these are by and large perishable skills. When I say perishable skills, if you don't continue to practice the skills of self-defense, they eventually erode over the course of time. And when we think about police training, oftentimes what happens is a police department will implement a level of training. And I give you an example. What happened with Eric Garner a couple of years ago on Staten Island. He was allegedly choked by Officer Pantaleo. You saw an immense level of training that was introduced to the department that evolved around implicit bias training. The training gets placed on the books, and then we just kind of forget about it. There's never really a sustainment piece or a reevaluation to that training to determine how effective that training is as it's being used in the field. I just think that we as police organizations need to constantly revolutionize the training. And I'm a strong proponent for self-defense training as well. So as you mentioned, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, I think Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is an amazing thing, because what happens with Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, it's not a measure on strength. It's more your ability to apply a level of tactics and use one's force against themselves. I think that that's tremendous, and it should be introduced. The U.S. military currently does use it, and they refer to it as combative, so to speak. I was a former officer in the Army, and that was one of the things that we trained on with the combatives. It was Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And I think that it was phenomenal, but it goes back to, it's a perishable skill, and you need to constantly practice it. And if you don't have that sustainment piece, then it goes to waste. So professional development is always at the forefront. But I always say that whenever we have a problem with any police organization, one of the first things that they tout is there needs to be more training. I mean, I'm all for training officers, but we get to a certain point where we have to say, hey, look, these cops are getting the best training on the face of this earth. So it needs to be, there must be another issue that we're not tapping, being implicit bias, how an officer applies force, how they protect themselves, how they protect others. And so it's a very comprehensive focus that we need to lend deference to, outside of just it being a training factor, and more so a policing factor. And that policing factor is far multifaceted than just self-defense or just training, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that was a fantastic answer to that question, and 100% educated me. So basically, the solutions, they're there kind of. It's just that they're not. Number one, they're not prolonged. So it's like once you get trained, it's on you to keep it going. But number two, the amount of times that they get updated, but also to your point, like, it's not just a physical. There's a mental. I think is what you were alluding to. There's a mental aspect to all of this. So that brings me to the next topic of emotional intelligence. Is a rather new term, at least to me. It's been introduced within the last few years that I've been taking like upper management courses and things like that. And what that essentially means is understanding your emotions and the emotions of the people around you. And I think that getting educated and understanding like yourself and how you work as a human, but also understanding the people around you and the way like they work, I think it's a skill that if we're not teaching all law enforcement nationwide, we need to be. I'm not going to discount that. I'm not going to assume that they're not. I'm going to assume that, they're taking some initiative to do this, but I will let you educate me. What are we doing with regard to that?
Emotional intelligence, I want to say over the last 5 years, has really...
Darrin? Hello?
Looks like, okay, cool. I'm sorry. The emotional intelligence was, I apologize, it looked like it blacked out on my screen. Emotional intelligence is something that's come to the forefront roughly over the last 5 years. It's not something that just applies to policing, but various aspects of employment. And it's more or less gaining a universal understanding of the format or the landscape that you're working in. And when I say working in, meaning that you're a part of. And I think that that is a great thing. And I think that this is something that's still at somewhat of a deciduous stage. I mean, I've heard experts speak to this time and time again, but it's ever so evolving. I'm a firm proponent in injecting anything that works into the process of policing in the United States. If it works, I'll buy in, and let's do a trial on this. Let's have a pilot project. With that pilot project, that's where we can assess the effectiveness of this. This is more a qualitative measure and not a quantitative measure. The qualitative piece, if you give it time, you have to be patient, you will eventually see the quantitative numbers gain a precipitous drop. But you have to give it time. You have to be patient. So that holds true with what I mentioned earlier. It's something that, hey, look, I'll buy in. Let's practice this. Let's see how it works. And if we can gauge the effectiveness on this and determine this as being something that's significant or it's satisfactory, by all means, introduce it into policing.
Yeah. So, a friend of mine, my friend Michael, has a great question, and I was getting to this. But first, if you were in these police officers' positions, right? Number one, real quick, what do you think, if you've given it any thought, was going through the arresting officer, the one with his knee on George Floyd's neck? What do you think was going through his head? Do you think he wasn't thinking at all? Do you think he was scared? Like, what was your impression?
Well, that's a really tough question for me to answer because, for one, he was responding. He responded as a backup officer. He wasn't the initial arresting officer. He merely participated in the arrest. It's legally, it's a hard argument for you to introduce as to what you think someone else is thinking. So I can only base my assessment on what was executed at the scene. And it appeared to be misconduct, gross misconduct on the part of the officer that had his knee lodged into the neck of Mr. George Floyd. And so I would say, as a supervisor or a police manager, you should be familiar with the provisions and guidelines attributed to the department standards. Therefore, you violated it. And as a result of that, we would have to move forward both administratively and criminally, which is already set. The wheels of justice have already since been set forth in motion. So going back to your initial question, what was going through the officer's mind, it's very difficult for me to assess what the officer was thinking. If the officer can introduce a plausible reason for why he did what he did, then let's hear it. But until then, we had probable cause that justified an arrest of this officer in this particular case, and therefore the wheels of justice and due process will play out, and that's when we'll hear the more widening discussion from the officer as to what he did and why he did it.
Right, and that makes total sense. Okay, so this is the question that we're probably going to need to take some time with. How do we move forward, right? And if you were in charge of everything, meaning like Donald Trump, our president, tomorrow said, Darrin Porcher, you can make the rules, you can make the regulations, whatever you need to do, push us forward, solve the problems we need to solve. You are the CEO of this country, go for it.
Well, whenever we look at the chief executive of a country, so to speak, and I give you the example of Donald Trump, the president is in no way, shape, or form a subject matter expert. What makes the president effective is his ability to appoint individuals that are the subject matter experts that can manage the inner crevices, or I want to say the granular aspects of government. So it's okay for whether it's Donald Trump, Barack Obama, or George W. Bush to not know anything as it relates to policing, but have a cabinet of advisors that will inform them of the pros and cons and the best practices. Now, after you extract that information from your advisory committee, now it's up to you. you are shouldered with the brunt task of ensuring that the proper execution of a policy comes to fruition. Now, what would I do to make things better? I mean, it just goes on a case by case basis, and I would have to revert back to my advisory committee of experts that would provide me with data that's sustainable data that if implemented, I can stand behind. So that question is very abstract, although I understand where it's coming from, because everyone asks when someone's running for president, what are you going to do to take this country to a better place? And it's really dependent upon where you are as a stakeholder for you to be comfortable with the answer that's being given. In terms of law enforcement, I believe that I can provide an appropriate response to that question, but there's so many other aspects attached to that question that are difficult for me to answer. And I'm not trying to be surreptitious to get away from your question, but I want to answer this as best as possible. I can speak to the best practices of a law enforcement agency. However, there are external issues such as budget and the voters in that particular area, these particular areas in different parts of the country that may have different wants and needs. So as a politician, you have to abide by the requests or the needs of these specific states, municipalities, etc. And I give you a contrasting comparison. We live in New York City. The rules in New York City are very different than the rules in a place like Jackson Hole, Wyoming. In New York City, I'm not afforded, I should say the average citizen is not afforded the right to walk around with a handgun in a holster as they go to Whole Foods to go grocery shopping. However, when you go to a place like Jackson Hole, Wyoming, you see everyone walking around with cowboy hats, holsters, and 357s in their holsters. So it's just, I give you that as a contrasted comparison and how the landscape changes geographically. So it reverts back to whoever that chief executive official is, that being the president, their decision making is contingent on the needs of those communities. And then we also have to take in consideration the triangulation of government. We have the legislative branch, we have the judicial branch, and the executive branch. The president is at the forefront of the executive branch, and with the executive branch, the police powers fall within the purview of the executive branch. When I say the police powers fall within the purview of the executive branch, the president appoints the attorney general. The attorney general is at the forefront of all federal law enforcement agencies such as the DEA, Secret Service, ATF. The president makes, and the FBI, the president makes that appointment. So therefore, the president is the person that's deemed as the chief law enforcement officer in the country. Things are ever so evolving in policy and practices in the criminal justice system. And we just can't, you as the president or the chief official need to stay abreast of those changes and make the applications accordingly. There's many times where things may seem, if everything that you do is accepted by the public and welcomed by the public, then you're doing something wrong.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. If you're not pissing people off throughout the course of your administration, you're not doing something right. Or because everyone is basically lying to you and telling you that you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and your inability to assess the granular component of the quote unquote boots on the ground, rubber that meets the road, is totally been eradicated, and you're in a blind space as a result.
So what I've gotten from this interview with you is it's not even that nothing is cut and dry. It's more so that what happens in the U.S. legal system, at least, is something like this happens, and we're going to wrap this up soon. I know we're on a specific time crunch here, but basically, something like what happened to George Floyd happens, and then you go through our legal system, and it's looked at from 50 different directions, and essentially, I don't want to say they give favoritism to cops. It's just written in the bylaws for cops that they have the power to kill somebody while protecting and serving. That's at least what I understood you say. Maybe I was incorrect to say that. I don't know.
I mean, for the most part.
Yeah, like that's like the most dumb, like the dumbed down form is they do have the power while protecting and serving to kill somebody, unfortunately, and sometimes things just like work for the best, and sometimes they work for the absolute worst.
Well, we use the term kill someone. I mean, I know that
what is it?
It sounds, when we use the term kill someone, I would prefer to say if in the course of the discharge of your official duties, someone loses their life as a result of your actions. That's probably the more appropriate way to look at it. Because when I hear someone say, you go out and kill someone, that means that you just went out there and you bludgeoned the guy with a machete or something to that effect.
I'm probably the farthest person from politically correct that you'll ever meet, but I get the
and
sense.
That's okay. Neither am I.
You explained it. I wouldn't want to put like the wrong like information out, but I was just trying to give it. Okay, it makes sense. It makes sense. It's an incredibly complex situation. So, how do you see us moving forward? Like, first of all, what changes would you personally like to see take place from this? And where do you think we go from here? How do you think the riots stop? Do you think that this curfew situation is going to do any good? Like, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think there needs to be a geographically different application from place to place, because the needs in a place like New York are going to be very different than the needs in a place like, let's say, Atlanta, Georgia. The citizenry is different. And I think the primary engagement evolves around a police and community relationship. That should be somewhat symbiotic. When I say symbiotic, meaning the two entities need to work together. There are different stakeholders that come into play in the equation, and their wants and needs are going to be different from one place to the next. But your most valuable asset is the intelligence that you garner from the community. Because if the community is giving you this information for intelligence purposes as it relates to what's happening with, let's say, riotous behavior, the community is telling you, look, it's John Smith. He lives on Austin Road, apartment 3B. That's a valuable piece of information that you can use to basically look to eradicate a lot of the agitators that you see at these riots. So it goes back to your use of the community, or I should say the police department's use of community intelligence should be at the top of the chart. What happened to George Floyd, that riot happened way before it actually happened. The reason why I say that is this. There was apparently a groundswell within that community as it relates to a dissension between the police and the community. There was a standing state of acrimony, and all this incident did was it was the straw that broke the camel's back. However, if you had the appropriate intelligence mechanism in play that would assess the pulse of that community, then before the George Floyd incident happened, the police would have had a better working relationship with that community. So when the incident occurred, you wouldn't have the combustible unintended consequence of riot that we see, because the both entities were constantly in correspondence with one another, and they would have been able to quell the disturbance. Therefore, on a national level, the same premise is true. This is something that happened a while ago. This was just the straw that broke the camel's back.
So what you're saying was there was definitely some sort of conflict within that community, probably with regards to the police and, the people that lived in that community, well before George Floyd ever was, his life was taken.
Absolutely. In addition to that, I mean, the same thing has happened here. In addition to that, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all had cabin fever for the last 2.5, 3 months. Yeah. And we're looking for anything to get us back into the street. And this just happened to be the valve that opened, that allowed us to express ourselves from a place of emotion.
Gotcha, man. No, you're 100% correct. Definitely very valuable perspectives. Darrin, I just want to, once again, man, thanks so much for joining. Really, really appreciate it. Is there anything else you'd like to leave with? Because I know you said you needed to, get out of here around 5 o'clock. Anything else you want to leave people with that might be viewing this right now? Any advice you want to give to everybody? Anything of real value?
Yeah, I want to let everybody know that that Mark is in commando mode, and he's not wearing underwear. He's just wearing a shirt. No, I don't really have anything else.
He's right.
Oh, he's right. He's right. Well, I'm not in commando mode. I'm actually wearing pants. But I don't really have much more to impart. I think that you did a great job in asking the right question and driving the narrative of the interview down the right lane. And I appreciate having you as a moderator, and I salute you as a result. Thank you so much, Darrin. Really appreciate that, man. Well, guys, thanks so much for joining. Once again, Dr. Darrin Porcher, former NYPD. We appreciate you for your service, and thank you for the education, man. There's so much that I learned that I had no idea about before this. All right. Thanks again. Take care. All right. Guys. Hope to see you soon, and stay safe.
We'll talk, man. Take care. Have a good one.
All right, you too. All right,
Bye.
bye.